The first time they tried to control my $5 million lake house, I honestly thought it was a joke because no one inches their right mind would walk onto someone else's property and start making rules like they owned it. But that is exactly what happened, and what makes this story crazy is not just what they tried to do, but how badly it backfired in the end. Because they picked the wrong house and end. He wrong person to mess with, and if you have ever dealt with HOA drama, you already know how quickly things can get out of control. So before I get into it, make sure you like this video and subscribe to HOA Revenge Files. Because stories like this only get crazier, and this one builds up in a way you will not expect. I bought this lake house after years of working nonstop, and it was not just about the money, it was about finally having a place where I could breathe, a place where mornings were quiet, and the only sound you heard was water moving and wind through the trees. The property sat right on the edge of a wide open lake with a long wooden dock and a view that looked unreal at sunset. And I made sure everything about it was exactly how I wanted it, from the design of the house to the open backyard that connected straight to the water. And for the first few weeks, everything felt perfect. No noise, no stress, just peace. The community nearby had an HOA, but before I bought the place, I did my research carefully and made sure my property was not fully under their control. It was close enough to the neighborhood to share access roads, but legally it stood separate, and that detail mattered more than I realized at the time, because it became the center of everything that followed it. Started on a calm afternoon, I was down by the lake, just enjoying the water, when I noticed someone walking toward my due. She was dressed in a bright purple outfit, holding a folder like she was there on official business, and the way she walked made it clear. She was not there to ask questions, she was there to tell me something, and when she got close, she introduced herself as part of the HOA and immediately started pointing out things about my property, like the dock length, the seating area, and even how close my setup was to the water line. I remember standing there confused because everything she mentioned had already been approved during construction. And I told her that clearly, but instead of listening, she kept talking about community standards and how my setup did not match what they expected. And that was the first moment I realized this was not going to be a simple conversation. This was someone trying to extend control where it did not belong. I stayed calm and explained that my property was not under their full authority and that everything had been built legally with permits and approvals. But she did not seem interested in that. She handed me a notice and said adjustments would need to be made or penalties would follow. And then she turned and walked away like the conversation was over, and I was left standing there holding a paper that made no sense at first. I tried to ignore it because sometimes these things go away on their own, but a few days later, another notice showed up, and this time it included a fine, and not a small one. It was $1,000 for using my own lake area in a way they claimed was not allowed. And that was the moment everything changed, because now it was not just out control, it was about money and pressure. I went through every document I had: permits, approvals, boundary maps, everything. And there was nothing that supported their claim my lake access was private and clearly within my property lines. So I decided to respond properly. I wrote back with full documentation, explaining that there was no violation and that the fine had no legal basis. And for a moment, I thought that would be enough. But instead of stopping, they pushed harder, more. Notices came in stronger language, higher pressure, and it felt like they were trying to overwhelm me into compliance. And that was when I realized I needed to handle this carefully, because reacting emotionally would only make things worse. So I stayed focused and started documenting everything, every notice, every message, every interaction around the same time. I started noticing something else. Neighbors were paying attention. Some of them had seen the notices, others had heard about the situation, and a few even approached me asking what was going on because they knew something did not add up, and that told me this was not just about me, this was something that could affect others too. One morning I walked down to the lake and saw her again standing near the edge watching like she was inspecting the area. And when she saw me, she did not hesitate. She told me directly that if I continued using the lake the way I was, the fines would increase and further action could be taken, and the confidence in her voice made it clear she believed she had full authority. That was the moment I stopped seeing this as a simple dispute and started treating it like something serious, because when someone is that confident without clear authority, it usually means they have not been challenged properly yet. And I decided that if this was going to continue, it would be handled the right way, step by step, with everything clear and documented. I contacted a property attorney and shared all the details. And after reviewing everything, he told Me something that changed the direction of this entire situation, he said. Based on the documents, your property is not under enforceable HOA control for these rules, and that meant the fines had no standing in hearing. That confirmed what I already felt. But now it was backed by someone who understood the legal side completely. We prepared a formal response requesting proof of violation and legal authority behind the fines, and at the same time asking them to pause all penalties until proper documentation was provided. And once that letter was sent, something interesting happened. The constant stream of notices stopped, and for the first time there was silence, and that silence said more than anything else, because it showed they were not as certain as they had been acting. Days passed, and eventually a response came, but the tone had changed completely. There were no threats, no demands, just a request to review the situation and discuss things properly. And that shift told me everything I needed to made to Kane. Oh, because when pressure turns into caution, it usually means the truth is starting to surface. And I knew whatever came next would reveal how far this situation would go. When I walked into that meeting a few days later, the difference was obvious. The same people who once acted like they had full control were now careful with every word, and the woman in the bright purple outfit who had been issuing NES did not carry the same confidence she had before. She still tried to hold her ground, but it was clear something had changed, and as we sat down, my attorney calmly laid out everything in front of them: property maps, permits, approvals, and the exact boundary lines that showed where their authority ended and where my property stood completely independent. There was a long moment of silence as they looked through the documents, because this was no longer about opinions or preferences. This was about facts, and those facts were clear. My lake access, my dock, and my usage of the water were all within my legal rights, and there was no clause that gave them control over it. And when my attorney asked them to point to any rule that legally applied to my property, they could not provide one. And that was the moment the entire situation shifted. They tried to explain that their intention was to maintain consistency in the community, but intention does not replace authority, and that point was made very clear during the conversation, because rules only work when they are applied within the limits of what is legally allowed, and in this case those limits had been crossed from the very beginning. And once that was acknowledged, the conversation moved from defending their actions to figuring out how to fix the situation. They agreed to remove the $1,000 fine immediately and to cancel any additional penalties that had been issued. And they also agreed to send a formal statement confirming that my property was not subject to those specific HOA rules, and hearing that felt like a release, because everything that had been building over the past weeks was finally being corrected in a proper way. But what made this situation even more interesting was what came next, because once everything was on record, my attorney suggested that we address something bigger, not just my case, but the pattern of behavior that allowed this to happen in the first place. And he proposed a formal clarification agreement that would clearly define the limits of HOA authority over properties like mine, so that this kind of situation could not repeat itself again. At first, there was hesitation, because putting something like that in writing meant accepting responsibility for what had already happened. But at the same time, they understood that avoiding it would only create more problems in the future, especially now that residents were starting to ask questions and pay attention. And after some discussion, they agreed to move forward with it. Over the next several days, that agreement was drafted and finalized, and it clearly stated that my lake house and the surrounding property were independent and not subject to the enforcement of the HOA rules that had been used against me. And it also included a requirement that any future concerns would need to be handled through proper legal channels instead of assumptions or direct enforcement. And that document changed everything, because it created a clear boundary that could not be ignored again. As for the woman who had started all of this, her role within the HOA changed after the situation was reviewed. And while I did not focus on that part, it was obvious that decisions made without proper understanding can have consequences. And in this case, those consequences were seen by everyone involved, because once the facts came out, it became impossible to justify what had been done. Life returned to normal. After that, the notices stopped completely, the pressure disappeared, and the lake went back to being what it was supposed to be: a place and quiet and end. One evening, I went down to the dock again, sat there and watched the water just like I used to before any of this started. And it felt different in a good way, because now I knew that everything had been handled the right way without unnecessary conflict. Looking back, I realized that staying calm made the biggest difference, because reacting with anger would not have solved anything. It would have created more chaos, and sometimes the best way to deal with a situation like this is to stay patient, let the facts speak, and handle everything step by step. And that is exactly what turned things around. If you made it this far, I want to know what you would have done in this situation. Would you have paid the fine just to avoid the stress? Or would you have pushed back the same way and made sure everything was handled properly? Drop your thoughts in the comments and share this story with someone who understands how frustrating HOA situations can be. And if you want more stories like this, make you are subscribed to HOA Revenge Files, because there are plenty more stories like this coming up and you do not want to miss them.